How many of you are software developers or engineers? Okay. Business people? A few business people, some of you are both. Lawyers? Ah, okay. So I haven't been a lawyer for a few years. I'm going to start by saying that. So let's see how we get on. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about open source and what lies ahead. And in doing that, I'm going to pick up on some of the topics that the last two speakers covered. And I'm going to do a lot of stuff in a short space of time at a high level. So if we've got time at the end, I'm happy to talk to you more about any of the specific topics or follow up with me afterwards. So I got into open source 16 years ago. I was a lawyer and I joined a company some of you will know, Canonical. I've seen a few Ubuntu t-shirts around the conference, and I know that the Ubuntu operating system is very popular here. And I worked on that through Canonical for about 5 years. I left Canonical and I worked in a law firm for a couple of years. And then in, what year is this? 2019-20, I joined Open UK as the CEO and effectively a founder because we've completely reinvented what Open UK is. So I do a number of different things as well as my job, like most people in open source. I've got a number of hats and I have been on different advisory boards. One of my favorite was with the UN. I have a couple of government appointments where I sit on UK boards. One of them is the Open Standards Advisory Board. And we've sort of seen over the last few years the rise of open source, which I'm going to talk about. So you'll see my name as CEO of Open UK on lists like this, which is very much about the status of open source more than it really is about me and how things are changing in the UK. And some of you will know this book. It was published in 2022. It's the worst thing I've ever done. It was, or it is, 640 pages long, and I've had to read it 4 times every word from start to finish to get the edit right. And last week I was in Shenzhen. I was Nadia's guest in Shenzhen and attending a really interesting OSPO conference there. And I met 20 people, and there are over 30 who are translating that book into Mandarin. It's a huge task that they're undertaking, and we're hoping that it will be ready in October. It was super interesting to meet all these different people and to hear all their complaints about how hard it was to translate it. It made me feel better about how hard it was to edit it. And there's 26 different authors. Some of them joined me to launch it at All Things Open a couple of years ago, quite a few women, as you'll see. And that QR code, if you want a copy, will take you through to my website where you'll find it for free. And it's available open access. Feel free to share that with anybody. But you've got 26 experts who really know what they're talking about around law. And of course, I spend a lot of my life traveling the world, doing this kind of thing, talking to people at conferences. Now, there's actually 2 of us in the room today from Open UK. My board chairman, Andrew Waffa, is also here. So thank you very much for coming all this way to just check up on my talk, Andrew. And you'll see that Open UK is a very unique organisation. There are other country organisations, but they're not quite the same. We started with UK leadership in open technology. And you'll see it's not open source software. And it's very specifically not open source software, because we want to cover all the opens. So software, hardware, data. And increasingly, we're talking about standards, about AI. The last speaker talked about the standards needed for the Cyber Resilience Act. So we're looking at those standards and we're looking at the different shades of openness. And that's something we see increasingly with AI. And we're a really big organization in that we have lots and lots of people involved, but almost everybody is a volunteer. So we have 3 members of staff and everybody else works on different projects within the organization. And we have lots of different sponsors who have contributed to our funding, some of them also giving us benefits in kind, which have allowed us to evolve as an organization and to start to organize our conferences. And we work on open technology. We do it collaboratively globally, but we do that on 3 pillars. So we do community, legal and policy, and learning. And by community, we bring together the community in the UK. We do it through things like awards, through honours, where we celebrate the achievements of the people in the open source communities, the open technology communities in the UK. We do it through law and policy. And what we do is give a voice to that community in the UK, and we influence law and policy. So we respond to laws as they're going through Parliament where we have opportunity. And we also try to set the policy agenda. And we do that by suggesting things. This is a venue we had at COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference. And we had one of the biggest events there in the Fringe with about 200 people right at the end of lockdown after COVID in this amazing venue talking about sustainability. And we delivered a blueprint there on data centers and making them open tech and making them more sustainable by opening them up. And we have since then produced another one on electric vehicles. And these aren't about creating code, they're about bringing awareness to it and showing how sustainability can be improved. We started reporting in 2021, and you can see our different reports online. They're all Creative Commons and open for you to use. And we started last summer talking about AI. And I will talk to you a bit about AI because it's really important to the future of open source. I'll talk to you about different aspects of it. But it's a topic that I've avoided. And I've avoided AI in the same ways I've tried to avoid security, because you really have to understand what you're talking about in these spaces. And there are lots of people with opinions on them who are not deep experts, and that's all a bit worrying because you really, really have to get it. Some of you were in the room earlier when Divya was talking, and she obviously knows about security in depth as a technical expert. It's not something I know about in that way, so I won't generally talk about it. But with AI, last year we got to a stage where we had no choice. And as an open source, open technology community, we had to start to respond. So you can see our first two reports on that QR code. And this year's an important year in Europe. It's an important year in the US and in the UK because we have an election in each country and our governments will change, and that will impact open source hugely. So this is our open manifesto that we are proposing to our government, to the political parties, and our asks that we have. So that's important from a policy perspective. And these are the three key asks that we have. And then our third thing is about learning and development, about skills. So we bring the community together, we use their voice to influence law and policy, and then we try and build skills. And if you look at our little circle with the orange, the green, and the blue, it's meant to represent the community, the influence on law and policy, and then the skills development. And one arrow leads into the other forever. And we did a kids camp that's quite well known. If you're interested in it, it uses a microbit. And there's 2 camps, 10 lessons each. The second one, I'm proud of both, but the second one I'm really proud of. We were the runner-up in the GNOME Community Challenge with it, and it teaches the open source definition, which we'll come to in just a minute. We also have these training sessions, again, freely available if anybody's interested in learning more about business. And they have a number of different founders who talk about all the different things you need to know about running a business in the open, the things that make it different. So please take the assets and use them. And in everything we do, we try to create a sense of belonging and make space for everybody who wants to be in there. I know 1 or 2 of you in the room were speakers this year at State of OpenCon, and we're in our 3rd year in 2025, 4th and 5th of February in London, and I hope we'll see many of you there, and we'll have more and more international delegates. Almost 40% of our attendees this year came from all around the world, and it's a really good opportunity to get together after FOSSASIA. So the real stuff I'm meant to be talking to you about, the future of open source. So what is open source? I've noticed quite a few talks today about OpenAI, where they've talked about open source and they haven't actually said what they mean about it. And I think increasingly what open source means is becoming important to us. And that's not because I'm a boring ex-lawyer, although I am a boring ex-lawyer. It's because we have to understand what open source is to have an opinion on it, to be able to say something should be covered in a law, or that we're doing an open source business or we're not. And this is the open source definition, which I think was 25 years old last year. And you'll see there are 10 different definitions. Now, I often joke that we should recite them together because we all work in open source. But the reality is nobody in this room, maybe Anne could actually, because Anne was quoting some of it to me earlier, but mostly nobody in this room could tell you what the 10 definitions are. And for me, I have two favorite definitions, 5 and 6. And they're my favorites because I think they are at the heart of what open source is. And that's that anybody can use it for any purpose. Obviously, you have to comply with the license and do whatever the license requires. That could be attributing the author. It could be making source code available, depending on what license it is. But at the heart, they all have this same requirement that anybody can use the code. You don't have to worry about who you are or where in the world you are, and you can use it for any purpose. So you don't have to think each time you use it, can I use it? You just know that you can. And that allows a free flow and a movement of open source software that we don't see in any other kind of licensing. Now, back in 2008, when I joined Canonical, we were trying to get people to use open source, and it was really, really hard. We were knocking on doors, trying to get it adopted in companies, and they were saying no. And the people who were saying no were the risk professionals, the lawyers like you and me, the accountants, and the procurement people. And they were stopping open source going into companies. But that's changed. The Synopsys report last year said that 96% of code bases have open source dependencies, and 76% of code in those code bases was open source. So how do you go in 16 years from it being so difficult to it being the norm? Open source is what we all use in our infrastructure today. How does that happen? Well, we see digitalization, and we see that over a 10-year period, but we particularly see it through lockdown and COVID. So any organizations that hadn't digitalized already suddenly did. And what we see is when you have a digital environment, that it's defined by software. And what that means is that engineers and developers, many of you in this room, suddenly have more power in companies. You have a higher status in companies than you used to. And we also see something, Git, become really well used. And it changes how we get our code. Now, back at Canonical, we had Launchpad, but the one that you will all know is GitHub. You probably know GitLab as well, and the way that code is distributed. So these engineers, with their newfound power, are able to go and take code, bring it into their organizations and use it. And they do that without having to go through the boring lawyers, accountants, and procurement people. So suddenly they bypass and they fill their companies with open source, and it changes where the risk sits in their company. Most companies don't realize that yet. But importantly, it allows for the adoption of open source. Now, some of you will know this gentleman, Steve Wally. He's a good friend of mine. And he was giving a keynote in 2018 in Edinburgh. And Steve talks about Microsoft. When I first got involved in open source, Microsoft was public enemy number one. Every joke that I knew about open source, the punchline was Microsoft. And today, Microsoft, according to GitHub,
Hello?
Thought we were having a battery change. Microsoft today is the number one company in the world in terms of contributions to open source. So how do you go from a company that was the punchline of every joke to being the biggest contributor in the world? Well, what Steve would tell you is that Microsoft has been on a journey. And that journey involves three major factors. The first one is that every engineer, every developer who has learned to code in the last decade, 2 decades, they use open source. They recycle, they reuse, they don't reinvent, they don't create things from scratch. So that's how they want to work. And if you want to hire them, and remember, the market is suddenly much more competitive because of that digitalization. People want engineers. So you have to allow them to do open source. The second thing he'll tell you is that some of the best innovation was open source and is open source, so their customers come to them and ask for specific technology that is only available as open source packages, open source products. And then the third thing, and I know we already heard from Roland about cloud and hyperscalers, is that Microsoft runs a cloud business. You probably noticed that. And if you want to run an organization like Microsoft Azure, you have to use open source. And it's no good if you're in business just to use it. You have to engage with it. You have to contribute into the community if you want to have influence, if you want to be part of the ecosystem, if you want your staff to learn skills. So Steve would tell you that Microsoft's journey was based on those three things. And those three things are, I think, the basis of every company's journey. And it's not just every company, it's also the public sector, it's also governments. And in the UK, we've had an open source first policy for 12 years. I think we were the first country in the world to have it, but we see that journey increase. So open source is one, but is it sustainable? And I think that's the big question for everybody. You could reframe that question and you could say open source is one, but what has it won? Has it won a war? Has it won a battle? Who knows? And what we see is an increase in businesses around open source as the adoption has got higher and higher. We see business usage increase because it builds our infrastructure today. And this report, on my slides, if you want to go and follow up, you'll find the articles and things there. But this report was actually done in 2008. And it's the first report that I'm aware of on business models and open source. And it has 8 business models, and they haven't actually changed. Some of the names are a bit different now, but the actual, what the models are hasn't really changed. And what it says in that report is that open source is not a business model. So whatever you use open source for, that's up to you. If you want to build a business around it, if you want to release your business software, that's up to you. But you will not make money, you will not run a business just because it's open source. You have to have a business model, which is a separate thing. And you have to think through, if I'm going to open source my code, what does that mean? And I used to, when I worked in a law firm, I used to say to people, what if? What if someone else takes your code and uses it? And they would usually understand that that's what open source is. What if somebody else takes it and makes money from it? And you could see that it's, mostly they weren't too sure about that. And then I would say, what if somebody else takes it and makes an awful lot of money out of it? And mostly they then didn't decide to open source their code. So although I really believed in open source, I was putting a lot of people off by telling them what the reality of open source is, that it's not a business model, that you have to have a business model. And that was in 2008. I was working in a law firm in 2013 and 14. So if we fast forward a few years, we see, I think 2021, Elastic, and I know Roland talked to you about the changes in licensing. And we see Elastic's founder, Shay Bannon, with this headline, and Shane's a long-term open source contributor who really understands it, but maybe hadn't thought through the business model, maybe had other reasons for why Elastic decided to change. But Elastic moved away from open source, moved away from that open source definition, moved away from an OSI-approved license, and moved to the SSPL, the server-side public license, which is not approved and wouldn't be approved by the OSI because it doesn't meet the definition. I think the thing that everybody was upset about here is it says doubling down on open. So if you read that, what it makes you think is that, oh, they're going really open source, when actually they're moving away, they're moving to a proprietary model. And then we see last year in August, HashiCorp, which is one of everybody's, or was one of everybody's favorite open source companies, moving away from open source as well to the BSL, another non-open source approved license. A few years ago, we saw Redis moved to something called the Commons Clause. It's not a different license, it's a clause that you add to an open source license. But of course, as soon as you add anything else, the license isn't approved anymore. And what that means is that it's not an open source license. So they did that for a little while, and now, just a couple of weeks ago, future of open source is the fact that we've got companies that are building a model around open source software that maybe don't have a business model, or have a business model that makes a lot of money. And in some of these cases, they're making a lot of money, but maybe they're not making enough money for their investors or their funders. So whatever the reason, what we're seeing is these single vendor companies in particular moving away. So I think we're going to see a couple of things happen because of this. We're going to see business models shift. We're going to see people looking into whether it's viable for them to open source their code, to think more about the business models when they're setting up a company. But I think we're also going to see a shift in how users choose open source, because there is definitely a vulnerability. There is a risk if you're using software that has a single vendor, that later on they might move away from it. We saw MongoDB's CEO use the term bait and switch. You know, when you go fishing and you have bait to catch a fish, well, what he was suggesting is that open source is a marketing tool and you use it as bait, and then later when you want to make money, you switch away once you've hooked your users. So I think whatever your thoughts on whether this is right or wrong, this is happening, and we need to put this into our future of open source. Vittorio was talking about the Cyber Resilience Act. I think it's a huge problem. I think it is likely to cause a lot of destruction in Europe into the digital economy. I suspect a lot of companies, a lot of small companies, a lot of individuals, as they create code, will have two options. They'll either have to put their code in a foundation so it becomes a steward and captured by the steward, or they will block their code going into the EU because they won't be able to take the risk. And I think what that may mean is that big companies, system integrators, the Fujitsus of this world, will take that code and integrate it and take on the liability as the first distributor, because the small companies won't be willing to do it. And I suspect it could hugely backfire on the EU, who want to be the next Silicon Valley. Because if you're making it harder and harder for people to create businesses and to scale businesses, then I don't think that's going to be the way to make your area the next Bay Area. And not only do we have the Cyber Resilience Act, which is tough, we've got the Product Liability Directive coming down the line. And in the UK, we're still at consultation stage, so we haven't quite got laws. Now, why am I telling you about these laws? Again, is it back to because I'm a boring ex-lawyer? No. Why do you think suddenly governments are interested? Why are all these people making laws about open source, or that in fact open source? Suddenly it is hugely successful. Suddenly it's the basis of every enterprise's infrastructure. Suddenly it's the basis of our national infrastructures and our national critical infrastructure. So of course it's something that's important. Of course it's something that governments want to see regulation around. I think they're taking the wrong approach. I think we should be looking at the end user, because the end user chooses what they use. And if they don't know what they're using, they ought to know what they're using. And liability, to me, should not sit with the companies, it should sit with the end user. And if you think about it, companies are already regulated in certain sectors. So things like mobile, healthcare, finance, heavily regulated. And the regulation for those is different from the regulation in our general economy. We also have issues with maintainers who are overworked, who are creating code that is used to huge value by companies, but who may not be making very much money themselves out of the code. And only last week we saw a real problem with a backdoor being put into a piece of software intentionally, a malicious act in a piece of software. And we see geopolitical shift, wars, Brexit. All of this has an impact on the future of open source. But I think probably the single biggest thing that's happening just now is AI. And you've seen lots today. These are the two reports I mentioned. I was forced to start to talk about it last year and to think about it. I will tell you again and again that I'm not an AI expert, but I do know a bit about open. And what we're seeing is 2 or 3 different problems from AI for open source. I think the first one is not knowing about licensing for the future. The second one is maintainers likely to have to deal with more and more contributions coming from AI. So submissions where they have to work out if that's AI generated or not, and whether or not they want to deal with them, and that the possibility they're going to have an awful lot more. And then we have this thing that I've already mentioned to you, the myths about open source and what it means, and understanding the definition, and people saying something's open source that isn't. So last year, almost a year ago, we saw GTP4 come out, an AI shift. We saw Elon saying that it really was meant to be open in the first place. And we saw Google reacting to Llama being shared last February. And Llama was shared by Facebook, and it was shared for research. It wasn't shared on an open source license. It wasn't approved. It wasn't meant to be used beyond research. And what we saw was it was leaked. And lots of governments want to know how it was leaked, and we don't have a conclusion about that as of yet. But what we do know is that when it was leaked, we suddenly saw a massive increase in innovation in AI. And that innovation increase came from the open communities. Last July, we saw Llama 2 being shared, and we saw it shared on a license called the Llama Community License, which is not open source. But Open UK decided to be one of its partners and to back that. And it's obviously quite a controversial decision, and it's one that my whole board took, because Llama's license, Llama 2's license, isn't an open source license. However, it's an open license, and we felt it was important because it was going in the right direction. And as you move through the last 12 months and you see more and more open source, we felt it was good to have something that was moving us forwards. Because when we saw Grok being released a couple of weeks ago with an open source Apache 2.0 licensed model and weights, we don't think we would have got to that so quickly if we hadn't seen those stepping stones. And we would like to see more and more of it being truly open sourced. But you also, as many of the speakers have told you through this conference, have to deal with open data. So in the UK, we, again, haven't regulated yet, but we have had a summit that brought many international countries together in the UK to look at the risks. And we've seen the G7 bring the Hiroshima process and a code of conduct forward. And as your other speakers this afternoon have told you, we've seen the first AI law in the world in Europe. It has 4 categories that are covered by the Act. And that AI Act has one that applies to the highest risk that applies to open source, but it has 3 exemptions for open source software. So of course we have to understand what open source software means, or how do we know that the exemptions will work or apply to our AI? But it is very complex, and we're back to these problems with regulators. And we're back to the problem of regulators needing to engage with open source and trying to work out what it means and trying to understand it. And we see the risks understood of closed source, proprietary software, and we see the risks that are associated with open source software and open AI being something that governments are struggling to understand. And we really need more organisations like Open UK talking to their governments and helping to explain to their governments and the regulators what open source is and how it works. Back in February at State of OpenCon, Open UK's conference, we saw Bruce Perrins talking about the future of open source. And what Bruce suggested was that separate to open source, there's likely to be a new category of software. And there's likely to be a new structure for that. And I have to say that I tend to agree, maybe not with exactly how that will manifest itself, how that will play out with Bruce. And I agree with Bruce that we're going to see something different. I think open source will stay in all of our lives and it will be something that is strong. But as we see more and more challenges from regulators, more and more companies trying to work out how to use open source and to build businesses around it, I think we'll see this licensing term, this licensing category that Roland was talking to you about earlier, become something that gets a name and gets recognized. And I think it's important that as an open source movement, we get behind that and work with it, because if we don't, there's still going to be confusion about what's open source and what isn't. So to make the future of open source strong, we need to see this other category of open software made clear. So I did say to you I was going to try and get through an awful lot in a short space of time, but all of these different things impact that future. If you have any questions or you want to talk about any of those topics more with me, I'm happy to. And thank you very much, all of you, for staying so late. Enjoy the rest of your conference.